November 24, 1968, 12:45 a.m. in Vallejo, California. It's a night that will forever be etched in the minds of those who witnessed the unthinkable. A family is brutally attacked in their home, leaving behind a trail of blood and terror. The sound of screams pierces through the darkness as a killer strikes without warning. The victims, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were on a date, driving down a deserted lover's lane. The tranquility of the night was shattered by the brutal actions of a serial killer. The scene unfolds like a horror movie, with shattered glass, broken fences, and a sea of blood-stained pavement. The air is filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers, but the atmosphere is heavy with the stench of death and destruction. The dim streetlights cast long shadows across the crime scene, making it seem like the killer has vanished into thin air. The victim's car is left stranded, with its headlights shining dimly into the darkness. The silence is oppressive, punctuated only by the distant hum of crickets. The killer moves swiftly and silently, leaving behind a gruesome trail of evidence. The wounds inflicted on the victims are brutal, with multiple bullets piercing their bodies. A small, neatly folded piece of paper with a cryptic message lies nearby, bearing the ominous sign of a cryptic symbol. The killer's face remains shrouded in darkness, his identity unknown. No one could have anticipated the terror that was about to unfold. Eyewitnesses report hearing the sound of gunfire and screams coming from the direction of the crime scene. They describe seeing a figure fleeing the scene, dressed in dark clothing. The sound of screeching tires and a fleeing car echoes through the night air. The darkness swallows the killer whole, leaving behind only questions and unease. The world is about to enter a realm of fear and uncertainty as the Zodiac Killer strikes. As police officers rush to the scene, they are met with a scene of utter chaos. The victims are lying in the grass, their bodies riddled with bullets. Blood pools at the base of the car, and shattered glass litters the pavement. The first responders are shocked by the sheer brutality of the crime. They begin to process the scene, collecting evidence and taking statements. They are about to uncover a trail of clues that will lead to the most infamous serial killer in American history. Before we go further, hit subscribe and the bell. We post new cases every single day. Let's uncover the truth behind the Zodiac Killer's twisted reign of terror. Let me take you back to the very beginning of this story, when the Zodiac Killer first emerged onto the scene. It's June 1966, and the police are stumped by a series of bizarre letters and codes sent by a mysterious killer known only as Z. The letters are cryptic, but they hint at a brutal and calculating mind. As we delve into the case, we'll discover how the Zodiac Killer's crimes escalated, leaving a trail of bodies and terror in his wake. As we explore the backstory of the Zodiac Killer, we'll examine the events that shaped his twisted psyche. We'll delve into the world of 1960s California, where the counterculture movement was in full swing, and the lines between good and evil were increasingly blurred. We'll examine the possibility that the Zodiac Killer was motivated by a desire for power and recognition, and how his crimes were influenced by his fascination with codes and ciphers. The Zodiac Killer's true identity remains a mystery to this day, but our investigation will uncover more than just cold facts. It will reveal the twisted mind behind one of America's most infamous serial killers. The Zodiac Killer, a moniker that has become synonymous with terror and mystery. At the center of this twisted tale is a man who will forever be shrouded in anonymity, but for the purpose of this examination, we will refer to him as the subject. Born in 1937, he lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, in the picturesque town of Vallejo, California. He was a young adult, barely in his 30s, with a life that seemed ordinary on the surface. He was a married man with a wife and a young child, and by all accounts, he was a loving husband and father. As a husband and father, the subject's daily life was filled with the mundane routines of suburban living. He worked as an electrician, providing for his family and taking pride in his steady job. He was a family man, but also a friend to his neighbors, someone who would often attend local social events and take part in community activities. His personality was described as quiet and reserved, not one to draw attention to himself, but a reliable and trustworthy member of society. His co-workers and friends saw him as a stable and dependable individual, never suspecting the darkness that lurked beneath. Despite his ordinary facade, the subject had his charm, and people were drawn to him. He was intelligent and witty, with a dry sense of humor that made him a pleasure to be around. He had a way of making those around him feel at ease, and his presence was often accompanied by a warm smile. This charmed exterior, however, hid a sinister secret, and those who knew him too well would later describe him as controlling and possessive. His charm was undeniable, but it was a thin veil that concealed a far more sinister reality. The subject's relationships were complex, and he trusted very few people. He was close to his wife, but even she would later reveal that he was distant and detached. He trusted his co-workers, but they were largely oblivious to the darkness that lurked within. He also had a close relationship with his neighbors, but this would ultimately prove to be a double-edged sword. His relationships were built on lies and deception, and those who knew him too well would later question whether he was truly capable of loving. The months leading up to the incident were marked by a growing sense of unease, a feeling that something was off, but no one quite knew what. The subject's behavior became increasingly erratic, and those around him began to take notice. He was distant, preoccupied, and his usual charm was beginning to wear off. His wife and neighbors tried to brush off their concerns, thinking that he was just going through a difficult time. But as the days went by, the tension grew, and the subject's grip on reality began to slip. The first warning signs were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they were there. A missing piece of mail, a strange phone call, a brief, menacing glance. No one quite knew what to make of these strange occurrences, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The subject's wife tried to downplay the incidents, thinking that he was just stressed or going through a midlife crisis. But as the events continued to unfold, it became clear that something far more sinister was at play. It was his neighbors who first noticed that something was amiss. They would later describe the subject as distant and cold, someone who seemed to be hiding a secret. But their concerns were ignored, dismissed as mere paranoia. The subject's wife, too, tried to intervene, but her efforts were met with resistance. As the days went by, her concerns grew, and she began to question whether she really knew her husband at all. But it wasn't until the early morning hours of December 20, 1968, that the subject's dark intentions were finally revealed in all their gruesome glory. And it was here, in the dark and fog-shrouded streets of Vallejo, that the true horror of the Zodiac Killer began to unfold. But who was this killer, really? Was he a monster, a madman, or simply a man driven to madness by the pressures of suburban life? The night of December 20, 1968, was one of darkness, with the full moon hidden behind thick clouds as Northern California was gripped by a cold winter. At around 9:45 p.m., the streets were quiet, save for the occasional passing car on the desolate roads. The temperature had dropped significantly, with a chilly wind blowing off the Pacific Ocean. It was a night that seemed to have no particular significance, yet it would become forever etched in the memories of those who witnessed its horror. The darkness seemed to be waiting for the events that would unfold in the next few hours. It all started with a seemingly normal night out for David Faraday, a high school student who had met his date, Lou Jensen, at the school's parking lot. They had planned to attend a Christmas party at a friend's house, but things didn't quite go as planned. David had stopped to refuel his car at a nearby gas station, where he met a friend who convinced him to take a detour through the woods. The woods would prove to be a fateful choice. As they drove down a deserted road, their headlights shone onto a figure waiting on the side of the road. As David and Lou pulled over, the figure emerged from the darkness and approached the car. He was armed with a gun, which he used to force them to the ground. The killer then opened fire, striking David in the chest and Betty Lou in the head. The shots seemed to come from nowhere, catching the couple off guard. In a split second, their night had turned from one of excitement to one of terror. The killer then took a strange step that would leave investigators baffled for years to come. The most shocking detail of the crime was that the killer had asked David Faraday for the time as he was about to kill him. This innocent question seemed out of place in the midst of such horror and would go on to haunt investigators for years to come. It's a detail that has been seared into the memories of those who have studied the case, and one that continues to baffle experts to this day. The image of a killer asking for the time as he prepares to take a life is a haunting one. It's a moment that would change the course of the investigation forever. We want to hear from you. What do you think really happened here? Comment below and let us know your theories. Was the killer acting out of a twisted sense of curiosity, or was there something more sinister at play? The possibilities are endless, and it's up to you to weigh in. Join the conversation and help us unravel the mystery of the Zodiac Killer. As the full scale of what occurred becomes clear, it's hard not to be shocked by the brutality of the crime. The fact that two innocent teenagers were gunned down in cold blood is a tragedy that continues to haunt the families of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. But as the investigation unfolds, it becomes clear that this was not just a random act of violence, it was the beginning of a twisted game of cat and mouse between the killer and the police. And as the police scramble to piece together the clues, they begin to suspect that they may be dealing with a killer who is more cunning than they ever could have imagined. But who is this killer, and what drives him to such horrific acts? We'll be exploring that question in the next episode of our series, as we delve deeper into the mind of the Zodiac Killer and his twisted game of terror. But for now, the question remains, what drove this killer to ask for the time as he prepared to take a life? Join us next time as we continue to unravel the mystery of the Zodiac Killer. The police first responded to the Zodiac Killer case in July 1969, when a cryptic letter arrived at the Vallejo Times-Herald. The letter claimed responsibility for a series of murders and tauntingly included a crude cipher. Detective Dave Toschi, a seasoned investigator, was tasked with cracking the code. Initially, police focused on gathering evidence from the crime scenes and interviewing witnesses. As the body count rose, the police were under increasing pressure to catch the killer. The key piece of evidence that changed everything was the 408 cipher, a cryptic message sent to the San Francisco Chronicle. The cipher was a complex series of letters and symbols, but police were convinced that it held the key to catching the Zodiac Killer. Detective George Beto of the San Francisco Police Department claimed to have cracked the code, but his solution was later disputed. The cipher remained unsolved for decades, but it remains one of the most enduring puzzles of the case. Meanwhile, the Zodiac Killer continued to taunt the police with more letters and cryptic messages. Who were the main suspects in the Zodiac Killer case? One of the most popular suspects was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted pedophile with a history of violence. Allen was investigated by police and cleared, but many believe he was the killer. Another suspect was Richard Gaikowski, a journalist and editor who had been involved in the early days of the investigation. Despite their suspicions, police were unable to gather sufficient evidence to link either man to the Zodiac Killer. Both Allen and Gaikowski have since died, leaving the true identity of the killer a mystery. The red herring, or the lead that wasted months of investigation, was the Richard Gaikowski lead. In 1983, Gaikowski's estranged wife came forward with allegations that her husband was the Zodiac Killer. Gaikowski himself denied the allegations, but police launched a massive investigation, raiding his home and seizing his computer. For months, police were convinced that they had finally caught the killer, but ultimately, the